few months ago, I discovered a ROM hack of the GameCube edition of Phantasy Star Online called Return to Regal. For a start, yes, this is something I would never in a million years have ever expected to see. ROM hacks for games on higher-end hardware than the Super Nintendo still feel like dark sorcery to me. And hacking an MMORPG seems like a dicey proposition, to put it nicely, particularly in a case like this, where I think players would be able to access the same servers with vanilla PSO. But also, it retools a lot of content to just make it a little bit friendlier. And let me tell you, I'm about as happy as a hog in the mud about this thing. So to celebrate, maybe a bit belatedly, I'm going to just gush over the story and atmosphere of one of my long-term hyperfixations and one of my all-time favorite games. One that's probably helped make me who I am today. At least in terms of interests. Maybe not in the most direct manner either. That fell apart awfully fast, didn't it? While I don't have great experience with the genre as it existed in the early aughts, I can still say it's pretty unique even for the time, since it does something that, in retrospect, feels a little antithetical to the whole conceit of the genre. It's always interesting to see the earliest phases of a new genre, so this remains a very memorable game. I'd probably remember other games like this pretty well if I played many of them. But that's not what we're here to talk about. There's one particular area in this game that sticks out, and it would regardless of when the game came out. Things are going to get very weird and very dark. Among the major Japanese RPG franchises, Phantasy Star has generally been one of the most in-your-face about how much it loves making cosmic horror stories with particularly unsettling themes underpinning them. Maybe really only second to Megaten in terms of its subtlety here, and PSO is no exception. As we fade through the intro, you should brace yourself for the following things that demand content warnings. So, before we talk about the main subject of the video, I want to spend a little time just discussing some of the various things I think are neat about PSO from a story and flavor perspective, because otherwise, I'm not sure when else I'll get to say them. Outside of quests, there simply are not any NPCs you can talk to on the surface of Regal, and you spend the entirety of the episode 1 plot following one singular person, which, by the by, you don't ever seem to be that far behind Rico at any point. Reading the logs that Rico left behind is the only communication you get on the surface outside of quests. Of course, Pioneer 2 has only really just arrived at Regal, and the Pioneer 1 civilization was wiped out at the moment of contact being established, so that's probably quite understandable. But the vibe is unique. There are NPCs back in town on the Pioneer 2, but only a few, with only a small handful of others cropping up now and again for missions. This is the only community you have access to on the Pioneer 2, even though it almost assuredly has massive residential sections for transporting the people of the dying planet Corral, and possibly more town-like structures as well. But there are about 30 people here to talk to if you count all of the NPCs who cycle out between missions, and that feels generous. Even in the town I live in out in the sticks, I've been to Magic tournaments with more people. And while it's true that this isn't exactly a civilian area, surely there are more hunters than just the ones you encounter in the story, and by a good amount, right? Like, that's fair to assume, right? This has always felt like a unique vibe among MMORPGs I've played, especially since the way gameplay is set up has players who connect to the internet in a system of lobbies, whose NPCs are mere set dressing and probably don't even count as characters, which let them set up what are basically game instances. The game doesn't feel especially small, but everything feels distinctly cordoned off, with all the people who aren't other players being confined more or less to one space, one which can only barely be said to have anything even remotely resembling the gameplay aspects one should already know. When you go out to actually engage with your quest, you and your party are making your journey completely alone. Even most of the old RPGs didn't go quite to this extreme in having nobody around for the entire journey. It's actually a little bizarre. It really adds to the unsettling feel that you get even when you don't know the story that well. And in particular, it's an interesting spin for an MMORPG, which is to say, a game in a genre very specifically meant to make interplayer interactions and, even if on some smaller level, a sense of community important, to be this intentionally lonesome. I suppose this is really the kind of oddball shit you can only get from a genre in its infancy, isn't it? Later, massively multiplayer Phantasy Star games were much more lively, and I'm not entirely convinced that this is just a matter of technical limitations, even though, yes, I suppose that didn't help much. Dipping a little more conclusively into mechanics, PSO uses a unique method of showing the player the current time. A one-day time period is broken up into 1,000 units called beats. The dot-beat system, hereafter just called beats for brevity, was developed by the Swiss watchmaker Swatch in 1998, and I have never seen this used anywhere else. I really feel like I should be able to say, oh yeah, the history of beats is super interesting, but it's not. I'm pretty sure Swatch doesn't even make watches that display the beat time anymore. And if even the creators have dropped it, you know that thing is dead, dead, dead. I don't think the idea was terribly popular. After all, we're all used to how we tell time, and that's a thing that's a constant around the world. Even most other serious futurists didn't seem that interested. This new change is just kind of disruptive, really. Especially because the day doesn't really do well being divvied up into a decimal amount of units. Each beat is an unsmooth 86.4 seconds long. Try to process exactly how long 84.6 seconds is. What's your point of reference? It's just rather odd, in short. Getting people on board with this would be rough because it has such weirdly sized units, even if the idea of 1,000 equal-sized units of time in a day sounds appealing at first blush. But it has one very big thing going for it. It looks very futuristic. Beats definitely feel like a sci-fi concept, even though most sci-fi works would probably choose something techier sounding like cycles as a name. But reducing something to a more base 10 friendly set of units makes it almost feel like a metric unit. And we all know science is done in metric. Don't tell anyone that the second is considered a basic metric unit already. So from a flavor perspective, this works. This is it, gang. This is the future of gaming. We know it because everything is neatly expressible in base 10 without weird units. Fitting, considering Sega's big boss man Isao Okawa thought of online gaming as the future of gaming at the time. Perhaps it's for the best he didn't get to see how that would end up. I wonder if a man so generous as to offer free online access to Japanese players at his, or possibly his company's, own expense would spin so fast in his grave at the amount of cosmetic gotchas included in PSO2 that you could wrap him in copper wire and use him in a generator. Those who would be worried about planning game sessions around something this arcane, which actually did matter for certain weapons, such as the infamous and ultra-rare Heaven Punisher, could at least have rested easy. Beats are totally predictable. I assume most players just ignored this unless it was important, as it might actually be if they were using such a weapon. Probably not a good choice for a mechanic, by the way, but I also likely don't have to tell you that. PSO's story hits a very particular midpoint between idealistic and cynical in its worldview. I think this is a good choice, mostly because, while I'm not convinced more cynical stories are more realistic the way I would say was certainly the common belief at one time, I think it helps to get a little bit of a mix, because it certainly makes the world feel more alive to acknowledge its darker side, but you risk going overboard and need to counterbalance this with some optimism occasionally. As early as the second offline mode quest, you have to help a landlord who jumped the gun on trying to apportion out Regolian land to sell to the Corallians and soon discovered it was full of monsters. He doesn't help you fight, he just makes you go pick up some marking capsules he left and stands in the one safe clearing you found. It's a reminder, after saving Ash's bacon, in a quest that probably felt simplistic and stereotypical even back then, that not everyone is going to be a standard RPG NPC in a living world. Sometimes you're gonna end up having to help sleazy cowards, or worse. Of course, quite a few of them tend to get their comeuppance, and even someone who acts in a particularly suspicious manner, Dr. Montague comes to mind, isn't necessarily guaranteed to be a bad guy. Admittedly, my level of Phantasy Star expertise for the original quadrilogy is way less than I posture like it is, but this feels like a thing that's not unusual for the series, to have a wide variety of motivations and characterizations to the non-playable characters. You'd think that this would be a thing in every RPG, but I somehow feel that, out of what I would consider to be the big three of early Eastern console RPGs, Phantasy Star, Final Fantasy, and Dragon Quest, Phantasy Star is the one where you're most likely to encounter non-villainous NPCs who are just kind of assholey. Not to the extent of Earthbound, where it feels like half the NPCs have more respect for the dirt stuck in the soles of their shoes than they do for you, but more than most of its contemporaries. I could talk about little things like this all day, but I want to get to the point so I don't just make this video only be 15% about what it's titled after tops. One more thing as a segue, though, is that I like how this game's plot, as far as your character is concerned, takes place over an extremely short period of time. It feels like it's literally only about a day long. Consequently, it seems like you're literally just behind Riko during her investigation the whole time, and you don't quite realize it. you're only just chasing after her. You never quite see her, but she's not that far ahead of you. If you'd been just a little bit faster, you could probably have saved her. But no such luck. Normally, I think this kind of futility would be rather disagreeable, but maybe it's the fact that you only just realize at the very end that you're not that far apart. You follow her closely from that surface forest all the way into the various facilities beneath the central dome, all the way to some mysterious ruins. Reaching the ruins starts to really hit the point where PSO goes from being simply a tad eerie and foreboding to outright scary, heavily grounded in cosmic horror, mostly via some classic sci-fi horror that I'd say inspired the rest of the franchise as well. After all, it is going to drop a final boss on you that's an eldritch nightmare whose only relation to any sort of readily identifiable biological forms seems explicitly made just to mock them. The monsters have a lot of that going on too. Even the simplest of these buggers, the humble Dominion, is a bizarre thing. Clearly alive, but with very little to it that properly matches up to any living creature. Thinking about how these things work is just a bad idea. Many monsters feature designs that seem to mock the very concept of life and how organic creatures are assembled. Take a look at the Claw, a creature which looks like it's constructed of the exact amount of tendons to make itself work and nothing more, and already resembles something disembodied. That stripped-back design of only the bare essentials to make a killing machine is a recurring theme with several other of these horrid things, but at its most keenly polished as a concept here. Or you have something more like the Chaos Bringer, a more complicated creature featuring organic weapons that are unequivocally human-invented weapons of war. Like, it just has a fucking gun for an arm, Chief. What else am I supposed to say about this? Even the giant swords mounted to the Grass Assassin's forearms could be called something else. The altered beasts still appear to be functional animals for the most part, but this thing has actual weapons for body parts and exists only to do violence. The questline also starts to head into much less happy territory in the ruins. Multiple quests feature important people dying, and you're just not going to get a lot of good endings even besides that. If you played the hidden quest chain up to this point, you can also meet the bloodthirsty android Curik for one final confrontation hidden in a ruins quest, and by this point he's gone completely off the deep end and wants to murder people with some mildly disturbing dialogue. You can even claim his weapon, the Soul Eater, a scythe with a rather nasty color palette which possesses the ability to instantly kill enemies with its special attack, and which also drains your health over time just by you wielding it. There's a little bit of disturbing material throughout most of the ruins quests, and not just because you're in the ruins, but From the Depths really takes the cake. Even at the start, we have a couple of hired goons who seem to be talking about murdering people in a way that suggests it's to silence certain people or perhaps cut them off from discovering certain things, and a sequence where a stuck ranger says something about having been trapped in the ruins for 100 years. Which suggests maybe he's been possessed because a guy from either Pioneer ship sure as shit has not been in the ruins for 100 years. But there's one sequence toward the middle that always gives me the Ghiblies. I don't know a lot about film, but I know that framing a shot a certain way can have a powerful effect on how one reads it. And this sequence demonstrates this, and the power of very simple acts, by reversing the usual shot framing, showing your character entering a room from a camera angle that better matches the perception of the other person who's already in there. With camera angles watching you as you enter in a fairly dynamic way that you would probably associate with other less than savory characters throughout the game, it makes you look like an aggressor. This, as it turns out, is perfect to get in the headspace of the Force who's been stuck here and ends up attacking you out of fear, but I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. The rest of the scene is designed to be disorienting. You converse with the girl, and she gives an account marked mostly by confusion and claims of hearing voices, while a mysterious voice communicates with you at the same time. It's hard to know where it's coming from, but presumably it's supposed to be the voice of Dark Falz, talking to... maybe to you? It's set up like it could be coming from the girl, too, and she seems to clock you as not paying attention, perhaps being distracted or otherwise in some sort of altered state. In a more meta-heavy game, this would be a joke about players just glossing over the text of NPCs, but I think the intent is to say that, seriously, something weird is happening to both of you. Something weird that the engine doesn't directly render super well, mind you, probably because it can't. Not without a lot of exceptions being made, and tons of resources that would take forever to make and take up a lot of space. Use your imagination, kids. It's the early aughts, you still have those, and they make up for the fact that the weird plastic box only renders graphics at qualities this high. I think this relatively low-tech way of depicting whatever the hell is going on here works especially well in a scenario like this. The whole point of this scene is to show how disorienting what's happening is, and it tries to accomplish that by instilling the same feeling in you. If the game operated on a higher level of tech, it could show you things in greater detail and with more action or possibly even voice acting, which I think would actually ruin this somewhat. Part of the expected reaction seems to be for you to go, what the hell just happened? And in something on newer hardware, they'd be able to show you more exactly, and then what would even be the point of your question? Restrictions breed creativity. Like, I'm sure the Silent Hill 2 remake is good, I've heard almost nothing but good things since release anyway, but the vibe is completely different from the PS2 original because the OG used its questionable graphical resolution to its advantage. Some of the themes touched on by this intrusion and the mindset, motives, and general MO of Dark Falz also crop up in a quest called Soul of Steel. Not to the full extent of something like The Thing, tragically, which this setup is ripe for, but we'll still get to talk about some classic sci-fi horror soon. I'm not talking about that quest because it sucks and I hate it. It uses stealth gameplay, for fuck's sakes. Stealth! In a game that's not based around it. Of course it's bad, because the designers don't know what a stealth game needs to feel fair and be enjoyable. Genuinely, From the Depths is one of the creepiest things I think I've ever encountered in video games that aren't explicitly horror games, even right up there with some shit in actual horror games. Helpful that it delves into the deepest floors of the ruins, because there's a lot of upsetting things to come across there. The ruins are a spaceship, but not just that. The ruins are a tomb, or some similar form of burial contrivance for Dark Falz. They are still very definitely operational too. By the second floor, you can see spinning mechanisms under the catwalks that make up the halls between major rooms. But reaching the third floor of the ruins is when the designers take the kid gloves off. Here's where you get some weird organic growth starting to crop up in the scenery. There were always those weird poison-spewing pustules to break in the earlier levels, but those could have been perceived as something that just lives there amid the ruins. This is actual terrain, though. Something alive is leaching out, or there's otherwise some weird biomass growing in the basement, here where Falz awakened. It's a sign of Falz's manifestation. It's not particularly scary, I guess, not really something you should be surprised to see, well, maybe this specifically might be, but it's also pretty gross. Fear and revulsion do frequently go hand in hand, I guess. But what's probably a little more off-putting is the prospect that this might constitute you navigating part of Dark Falz's body, partially tethered to its spaceship tomb, possibly one of the first things it infested. And remember, it's been made quite clear that the D-cell virus that Dark Falz emits can infect machines, so why not, right? In case this place didn't upset you enough, in your stomach or otherwise, I'd like to share an interpretation I heard about a part of this environment once. The idea went that the content of the floor is somehow reflective of Rico, perhaps because Falz also possesses her through D-cell infection. The theorists pointed to the weird floating particle things in this one room as resembling sperm, and basically implied that Dark Falz, how do I put this politely? I think it would go like this. The implication is that Dark Falz violated Rico sexually. Now, normally I don't give two shits about some random internet user's stupid, edgy darkfic prompts, but this does connect to some feelings I've had about the Phantasy Star series for many years. This is, needless to say, an absurdly touchy subject that I'm quite worried I might sound really disrespectful about because I'm an incredibly awkward person who does not always speak or write well around sensitive issues and frequently uses blunt language as part of a joke or a bit. But this is still a pretty weird thing to say in most cases, right? I think most folks would probably look at this sudden bombshell drop of implied rape as being a massive tonal shift. And yeah, it's pretty damn abrupt, but it's not necessarily the most impossible of directions, depending on how close the writers want to hew to one of the apparent major inspirations for the area. Inside this bubble of PSO as cosmic horror, there's one specific source work that the Ruins chapter borrows heavily from for themes and such. That being, as it frequently is, and in fact has been at various other points of the franchise including its very first game, Alien. After all, this is a derelict spaceship abandoned on, or in this case under, a planet containing a horrifying alien life form that infests others in what is, at least in Dark Falz' case, implied to be a violent manner, and which clearly is so for the not then called a xenomorph alien. Dan O'Bannon, the late screenwriter of Alien, was incredibly frank about what the theme of the movie was in interviews and documentaries. Hopefully, YouTube won't read me the riot act about including these clips, but if it does, the unadulterated version is always on my Patreon. Hey gang, I decided to not even chance it with any of YouTube's copyright strike bullshit, cause I just don't want to go through that. The irony of it is that the video clips that I was going to use here are things that I found on YouTube anyway, but that's beside the point. The clip that I was using originally was from a documentary called Alien Evolution, wherein Dan O'Bannon, who was one of the screenwriters on Alien, explains in no uncertain terms that the film is one about alien interspecies rape. There's a lot of pretty good stuff in that documentary, by the way, if you're at all interested in the film series. So if the Alien series is something that interests you, I would highly suggest going and looking for that documentary. Again, it is called Alien Evolution. I believe it came out in 2001. And yeah, anyway, back to our story. Certain thematic elements of Alien end up sneaking into many Phantasy Star games. Or perhaps the comparison is unavoidable when it features a woman fighting against a particularly bizarre-looking alien horror in a sci-fi setting. If there is any deviation here, it's that this is way more blatant than the Phantasy Star series had, or, to my knowledge, ever would get with this particular idea, and that Rico is not able to defeat this thing. The goal of a wide appeal with a character like Alice Landale probably precluded them from going fully throated with the alien inspiration in the Master System days, if that was ever even a target. Not because an Ellen Ripley sort would inherently be someone with more niche appeal, even though that was probably true back then, but because tackling some of the heavier subject matter that forms the basis of Alien as a horror film that makes everyone recoil in the same way is what would probably cause some issues. It's pretty easy to read things as being very similar to each other. Stories eventually become archetypal. Yes, feel free to throw this right back at me. I can see why someone would come to that as their conclusion about what happened to Rico, even without making any Freudian accusations about these weird particles, or without having a particularly dark mind. It positions Dark Falz as a special type of violent force, albeit perhaps one that is bereft of any femininity one would attribute to the xenomorph. I've said this before in long-deleted videos where I don't think I cooked enough, but I definitely still get on with the basic ideas, that Phantasy Star has frequently had some psychosexual themes under the surface. Frequently about women battling masculine-coded entities looking to do violence to them that are just ripe for a smarter video essayist to glom onto. And yes, I'm saying this with how many of them feature male leads, and yes, I'm even counting Phantasy Star 4, whose final boss looks like this. Incidentally, Phantasy Star 4 is the only game I can think of offhand that has included the word phallus anywhere in its text. Yes, there's an enemy late in the game called the Pro-Phallus. Sega were insane for this. I bring this up because I've read before that certain iterations of Dark Falz have been mistranslated as Dark Phallus throughout the series, and I'm really curious if that counts as giving the game away or not. I'm really serious about this. One of you smart people out there, make this real so I can feel like I'm less off my rocker on this one. Let's get away from the heavy shit though, or at least mostly, soon entirely. I think there's this tendency for sci-fi horror to trend in a direction that picks up extremely basic whiffs of Alien, not just because the film is now pretty well known and respected, but because, when you sand it down to its fundamental parts, Alien is more or less a type of cosmic horror story. Regardless of whether or not O'Bannon got woken up in the middle of the night with the suggestion that one of the aliens should lay its eggs inside a guy. It's about a group of folks discovering something that can be described as being fundamentally hostile to humanity. As science fiction more or less requires a world where humanity is more knowledgeable than they are at the time of its writing, the possibility of finding something that's dangerous just for us to have learned about is pretty attractive as a source of conflict for a more disturbing science fiction story. The creatures don't even have to be particularly nightmarish, but it happens pretty frequently anyway, as happens back in the thing we're actually talking about. No, unfortunately, I can't find a good excuse to use the phrase Weyland-Yutani and stay truly on topic here, unless Episode 2's story is a little different from what I remember. So, what exactly is this thing anyway? What can we say about Dark Falz? Just looking it over won't tell you too much, although you should probably note those very humanoid bits. Also, the face looks like some kind of goofy low-polygon turtle monster to me. I think a goofy low-polygon turtle monster elsewhere in the game has that face. Dark Falz, at least as described at the earliest point, doesn't have a physical body, instead being sort of a parasite of the metaphysical parts of a living being. We get to see an image of it manifest in the intro cutscene, where it has a familiar shape but is transparent. so we should assume it's not very solid at that point. Not until it blows up Central Dome. So, despite its non-physicality, it's still able to manipulate the world, presumably through whatever photons or however magic works in this game. Something I saw while reading some stuff about the game said that during the Central Dome explosion, Dark Falz absorbed all of the victims. I'm not sure where this comes up in canon if at all. It's probably an episode 2 thing if anything, but if so, that'd give a good reason as to where Dark Falz gets a bunch of mass from, which it might need to manifest a body that huge. However, that does raise some further questions since, again, it seems that Dark Falz doesn't manifest until it gets to Rico. So why does she end up being the linchpin specifically? And I'm afraid I don't have an answer here. Her ring is pretty strong when it drops, but it's a piece of equipment in an MMORPG, so its plot relevance is likely to be pretty low. Maybe she was just the exact right amount of extra meat that Dark Falz needed to manifest its oversized Final Form Sigma battle body. It's just kind of normal for a lot of fiction to assume certain things only have two states. Regardless of any of that random speculation, I assume it was just a minor contrivance on the writer's parts. In this body, you can see some recognizably human features in places, whether it's a rough overall body plan with head, neck, thorax, abdomen, then things for locomotion, the two arms positioned in an extremely human way, the distinctly humanoid miniature arms with hands, or that creepy misshapen face. Dark Falz has clearly picked something up from the things that it's devoured and processed to build its massive mass. On some level, this, combined with the recurring refrain of Dark Falz seeking evolution, makes it feel a little like Lavos, but on a smaller scale and in a weird way, since it didn't really observe evolution itself. Unlike Lavos, as far as we know, it might possibly have taken a more proactive approach to all this. A meteor landed on Corral sometime before the launch of Pioneer 1, which contained photon energy and something later recognized as D-cells, a virus of sorts emitted by Dark Falz that it uses to infest living creatures and sometimes even machines, possessing their minds, making them violent, and even sometimes transforming their bodies. Much like Lavos, though, Dark Falz doesn't have much of a character. This sort of deep dive into its characterization is probably better suited to the incarnations in PSO2, really, but maybe we'll talk about that some other time. For now, I'm left speculating about Dark Falz. So I will, because why not see what we can come up with? In several missions, Dark Falz seems like it's actively trying to trick people to bring it aboard the Pioneer 2 and expresses a desire to evolve. It also seems to resonate well with Ult in the mission Soul of Steel, who is tired of being locked up in a lab and wants to get out more. In a sense, she wants to evolve too. This casts Dark Falz as being something of an infiltrator, aiming to be secretly brought into the human world by someone it's bound to so it can destroy humanity from within or corrupt them all with evil or whatever. This isn't really that far off from how Dark Falz operates in previous Phantasy Star games, taking hold of existing folks like King Lassic or Zeo and turning them evil. Or probably more like more evil in Zeo's case, if I remember Phantasy Star 4 right, which I'm not sure I do. So I guess what I'm saying here is that some things really do never change. But the vibe is a little different here. All this talk of evolution and the way Dark Falz is more or less shown trying to wheedle its way into people's brains makes it feel like it's taking more of an angle of trying to assimilate all life on the Pioneer 2, which of course matches up with how it dealt with everyone from Pioneer 1. So maybe this isn't one of those some things that never change. Making this comparison has led to a bit of a stumbling block for me though. See, back in the main series, Dark Falz, in all of its iterations, is the offspring of sorts of the Profound Darkness, as detailed in Phantasy Star 4. Basically, the Profound Darkness is, as you'd expect, the ultimate in evil things, and the polar opposite of the Great Light, which created the algal system. The Profound Darkness is, as a consequence, ontologically dangerous to the people of the algal system and, as far as I remember, the rest of the universe. Contact with it alone is destructive, like matter and antimatter, but probably less explosive. The universe was created by the Great Light as a prison for the Profound Darkness, and its inhabitants were meant to keep it sealed. This eventually leads to a pretty interesting sequence where the lead character Chaz starts to ask some questions to do with free will, and ultimately it paints the whole situation as one where a right and wrong answer are hard to find. The Profound Darkness seems more like it just wishes to be free more than anything, and Chaz goes along with the plans of the Great Light because he wants to help the people of Algol, not so much out of interest in being a part of the machine. But that's one for another time. In PSO, there is neither a Great Light nor a Profound Darkness, unless Dark Falz is basically the Profound Darkness. Hey, it wants out of its prison very badly, and with no more motives described, it's possible. But so far as we know from the text, Dark Falz is just kind of isolated from anything bigger, and in fact seems to be the top dog. There might be something bigger in Episode 3, but I last played Episode 3 when it was new, and I can't muster the interest in playing it because I assume I'll just find it to be a huge pain in the neck. All I remember of Episode 3's plot is that it's outright said that various hunters have been killing Dark Falz and Episode 2 final boss Olga Flo over and over in a time loop, with them getting stronger each time until it's become a real problem. And I think there was some implication that Dark Falz and Olga Flo spawned one of the playable characters? I don't remember that for sure, though. Regardless, it's a little unusual for the series thus far, and I wonder if there was intended to be something bigger. This probably only counts as a flaw because it's a scaling back compared to previous canon lore, and PSO may as well be a separate universe if it's not definitely so. Where things do not depart from the main series at all is in a major aspect of Dark Falz' design, which I've brought up before as resembling a mockery of nature. I just want to talk about that some more because ultimately, I think this thing kind of gives me the willies. That sense of wrongness continues into the third form, a special form you see only if you don't play on normal difficulty. Here we can see that the overall body plan of the Dominion gets repeated, but more elaborate, and critically, with fewer legs. Critically, because that's the thing that makes you want to throw yourself in front of a train if you're playing an android like I was when I captured this footage. Falz has the same weird structure in the middle of the torso, but it looks more mouth-like now, with weird structures on the side that almost resemble teeth, but not quite. Especially because they move, and of course, they're in extremely the wrong place. Falz also has blade arms. At this point, this probably isn't that weird, but the devil is in the details, I feel. This exact shape doesn't look like it would be useful for anything other than for hurting others. Obviously, it would be a little hard to grip. These aren't exactly claws attached to a hand, and in particular, the way this blade curves outward doesn't make it look like it could be useful for locomotion in any way. The altered beasts in the cave still mostly resemble animals, despite some of them growing lightsabers and shooting lasers. The Dark Monsters, and Dark Falz itself, only superficially resemble animals because it's simpler than the alternative. These are creatures whose sole purpose is to kill. Not merely a mockery of life, but an enemy of it. You could very easily say Dark Falz is an angel of death. Perhaps not abstract enough to be full-on biblical, but still pretty weird. Certainly enough to be as terrifying as the title demands. I'll let you up to breathe now before I choke you out with my being a total freak about this game. This game is old, janky, poorly balanced, tediously slow, grindy as all hell, occasionally subject to rough translations, not always well written, and forces you to use a cheat device or play online, for which there are no longer official servers, which means that, if you're the sort of person to get into this kind of argument, you might consider that to be going outside what the devs intended, counting it as similar to a glitch, exploit, or even a cheat device to access certain items, and is pretty high up on the list of weird hyperfixations I could discuss for hours on end. If you need a bigger lesson out of this video, it's that you too should glom on to some absolute mess of a game and revere it like it were the perfect 10 out of 10 that only you can truly perceive it as. It makes you normal. But really, by now, the thing you should know is that this channel is just about shit I think is cool or at least pretty interesting. That doesn't always come with some sort of bigger message. But it's getting pretty close to Halloween. In fact, it may even be Halloween when this goes up. So, I suppose I can leave you with one last deeply upsetting fact. According to canon, the D-cell virus can infect anything wounded by one of the dark creatures. For a good, as in strong, not as in it's a good thing this happened, example, take a look at what became of Heathcliff Flowen in the Seabed Lab, becoming the final boss of Episode 2. Now imagine something much worse happening if you're not immediately quarantined. Additionally, this kind of implies that Dark Falz' legacy of evil may well live on forever in Pioneer society. The people of Corral are truly doomed to a particularly bleak existence, huh? Happy huntings, friend. Hope you never took damage in the ruins. Ever. Hi everyone, thank you all for watching and listening to me say things about this game that are probably just completely ridiculous. That said, it was pretty fun. I'm surprised I was able to actually find that Alien documentary so easily. I heard about it and I was like, oh, I'm probably gonna have to invest in some sort of like very specific special edition of this movie or something to be able to get hold of that. Luckily, no, it was just hanging out there on YouTube, so that's cool. If you'd like to hear me talk more about video game stories and stuff like that, like the video, leave a comment if you've got something to say, and of course, subscribe. Make sure you click on the bell so that way you get notified when new videos come out. It's a pretty good way of getting notified about that stuff. I've used it more recently, and it's a little slow by email, but otherwise usually pretty good. Of course, if you'd like to support this channel a little bit more, head on over to patreon.com/moonsidian, that's M00NSIDIAN, and pledge whatever amount of money monthly. I think there's a $1 per month minimum just because of how Patreon works. Patrons of the Almanac gain access to new entries 3 days in advance, plus there's some bonus content available for supporters. And there will be even more as I go. I'm going to try to make this a regular routine thing. I stream at twitch.tv/LunarianDelia. It's Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Soon to be switching over to Central Standard Time because of, well, the ending of Daylight Savings Time. On occasion, I will start at either 6 or 8, but what I aim for is 7, and streams usually last for about 3 hours. Okay, that's it. God, 2 minutes for an ending sequence? That seems awful. I will see you all in the next video. Have a good evening.